It may not be fall just yet, but it is football season, so it might as well be. And this is another episode of the Mic Drop Podcast, brought to you by the Believe Network and available everywhere you get your podcasts: Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, etc. I'm Mike Asti, and we're going to talk some football on this show, and that's kind of putting it mildly. And I'm going to have that conversation with somebody that I think many of you will have watched in the past and maybe still listen to now. You probably have watched her in the past on NFL Network. Lindsay Rhodes, she hosts a show right now on Sirius XM Fantasy. So I'm going to bring her on to talk some NFL news, some off the field, some players with pressure. We're dipping into fantasy as well when we have her, of course, and have some fun. So without any further ado, Lindsay, thank you for joining me as I unmute you. So I appreciate the time.
I'm glad that you did it, and so I don't have to, and so none of the pressure's on me to be like, you're muted, which always happens for the first half of every conversation that I'm in this type of platform. But anyway, hi.
How are you? No, I did. Yeah, I pressed it and I saw you about to talk before I could get there. So I was a hair late on trying to produce while hosting this. But you're unmuted. I am unmuted. People probably that know me think I can talk through being muted and be loud and still heard. And it's rubbing off of my daughter right now. But yeah, she's very loud. She just turned 1, so she's into the babbling. She's not going to get on this show. She's yet to make her radio broadcast debut, but a couple times have been close calls. But yeah, it's football season in the air. So no matter whether anybody has a pumpkin spice latte or some candy corn, which is a thumbs down for me.
Oh, 100%.
And
who likes candy corn?
Yeah, the late great Mike Leach hated some candy corn. So I follow the Mike Leach rule of thumb there on the candy corn. But however you may want to enjoy your football, even if it's with candy corn, we got a lot to talk about here. So to kick things off, for lack of a better pun, yeah, I know. Just thought that right now off the cuff there. But before we get into some fantasy and maybe even splice this into maybe Pittsburgh talk here as well, because I am in the Pittsburgh market and cover the Steelers and all of that. Just overall in the NFL scope, and you can go Steelers if you want. Who are some players out there that you think are really under pressure to perform? And meaning seriously, not maybe like we're trying to drive the conversation, but really need to get it done. Or this could be the end of the line for them with their franchise, or maybe their career and legacy is not going to go a certain way, or their money is not going to be right, which we'll get into later. Like, who are some players that jump out at you in they got to get it done in the 2023 season?
The first name that pops into my mind there, and there's another one who does also, since you're in Pittsburgh, we'll go in that direction in just a second, because this is not where I would lead. The first one is elsewhere in the AFC North, and I think Deshaun Watson is the guy.
That's
I think that
a good one.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much pressure on him because everybody is focused on him taking a massive leap forward this year and becoming the Deshaun Watson that we used to know. What's that song? Somebody that I used to know.
Yeah,
anyway.
Somebody that we used to know. Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Yeah, Browns fans never got to know that guy.
No, but they sure paid for him, and they haven't seen him yet, you know? Right. So I understand that at the end of the year last year, like, I mean, it's understandable to a degree that when he took the field, he wouldn't have looked immediately like the guy that he did 3 years ago or whatever, when he was like Deshaun Watson.
Yeah.
But he didn't look good, and the passing game didn't look good, and it got a little bit better at the end, but like we just didn't get a chance to see any kind of payoff. Like, oh man, they sure took it on the chin from a PR standpoint, taking on that contract, taking on him, embracing the whole situation, as gross as it was.
Yeah.
At the very least, if you're them, you're like, I kind of need you to be real good at football, because we are dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff for having signed you. Right. So he wasn't. And I think that puts him in a really pressure-packed situation heading into this season, partially because of the money, partially because a lot of people are primed to not like him and not want to root for him anyway, and are sort of rooting for him to fail for reasons that have nothing to do with football.
Right. The Browns basically risked their fan base and ticket sales for this guy. Yep. And so far, it's hard to say it's been worth it. But maybe they were thinking about this year, because as you mentioned, They probably are realistically okay kind of punting last year, figuring he needed a year under him. But
I'm sure they weren't expecting him to step on the field, first play dart for 70 yards to like Amari Cooper for a touchdown. And they're like, that's what we got. Like, I'm sure that they were ready to capitalize some sort of shaking the rust off. But I also, I don't know. I found it to a degree. I found it concerning that he didn't look better once he did step on the field. Again, saying like my bar is not that you are automatically competing with Patrick Mahomes for the title of best quarterback. It's just like it's much higher than what we saw from him. And then
although they're paying him like maybe he should get up there pretty soon.
100% they're paying him that way, but that's a totally different conversation.
Sure.
So I think he's under a ton of pressure. And I think that the whole Browns conversation starts and stops with him. For me, like it's even hard to try to handicap what they're going to look like this season. You talk about, and I also was a little bit concerned about the first few weeks in training camp. And this is to a degree the story that you hear coming out of every training camp for the first few weeks. It's like, oh, the defense is ahead of the offense. And like, but when you're reading like the passing game has looked very not good. Like those were the types of sentences that I was reading about Cleveland for the first few weeks. And then it kind of came together in the last week a little bit more. And so I will be keeping an eye on them in week 1 and wondering what it's all going to look like. And then, from a fantasy standpoint, obviously I've been in a space where I've just been drafting like crazy for the last few weeks. And like, I don't know what it looks like. I think Amari Cooper kind of got pushed down the board a little bit because they brought in Elijah Moore. And so they keep talking him up and what that's going to look like. I have questions about if he's really that good, why would the Jets have let him go? Why would you? I mean, you make it work. Like this is one thing we know about the NFL, and Deshaun Watson is example A, B, and C. Like if a player is good at football, people make things work. They make exceptions for people who are exceptional. So if Elijah Moore is really that guy, and he's coming from a team that was just desperately looking for wide receivers, like, hey, anyone want to make a play? Like we'd love to be better. And they were like, no, except for you. We don't want you. So I'm a little bit concerned that the Elijah Moore hype might not hit. Anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying that I don't know what to do with the Browns. Deshaun Watson there's high expectations. People are taking him in fantasy or, they're not taking him like in the top. He's QB9 coming off the board, but that's still early enough.
I was going to
ruin your team.
I have a draft tonight. I was going to ask kind of where you've seen him get drafted
9.
Because okay. And
9, but it kind of fluctuates a little bit. Like sometimes people will take Dak before him. Like I personally, and I don't want to, like everyone, I know there's been a lot of conversation about Deshaun Watson and the off the field stuff and how it makes it very uncomfortable. I think Kyle Brandt did a really, really good soliloquy on GMFB about how he's a tough person to talk about. Like you can't just responsibly, I think, just push that all aside. Like we're just going to talk about football and like sing his praises and like all of those women. I think about how that would feel if I were one of them. And all of a sudden this person who did this thing to me people were like, oh, well, that was handled. And so, yay, I think I would feel pretty crappy. So there's part of me that does feel gross talking about him, even just saying the things that I'm saying and then moving on to football analysis. So I think he's a tough person. Fantasy, you want to draft people that you want to root for. And that's obviously going to, fluctuate with regards to who's willing to put him on their roster when you have other options. And, but in general, his ADP is QB9. Lindsay can talk.
Yeah, and I guess like QB9 when you think about it, because Dak Prescott is obviously another player that we could easily bring up.
Yep.
You just had pressure because you're the Dallas Cowboys quarterback, and Jerry Jones is almost trolling the environment by bringing in Trey Lance and saying I refuse to tell anybody and winking about it. Like that was kind of odd, and it almost feels like he's either trying to rock the boat or trying to put pressure on Dak or trying to send a message that, hey, Dak, if you don't get it done, I'll easily cut bait. It's a 4th round pick. So I guess if Trey sucks, it doesn't hurt them. But there's a lot of mental gymnastics going on there, and they're going to be obviously heavily covered. But it is interesting because there's another argument out there I've seen people make that Dak has had pretty much an entire career that's been good and then one bad year with some picks. And now he's being treated like a guy that no one wants to root for with Deshaun Watson, who hasn't been good in 3 years. That's almost oddly unfair to Dak when you think about it. But Dak's certainly in the pressure cooker when you're a Cowboys quarterback.
Well, I mean, you're always going to be, no matter, I mean, you could be great and be the Cowboys quarterback. You're still going to be in a pressure cooker unless you're winning Super Bowls every year, right? Like the expectation is different. The lens is different. Spotlight's different, all the things. I didn't particularly read the Trey Lance situation that way. Like if I was Jerry Jones, I'm trying to think of a scenario where
Didn't tell the coach either. Like, it's just funny.
That's kind of weird. But also, I think that to a degree, you're like, it's a 4th rounder for a guy that a couple of years ago people thought was worth the number 3 pick. Like, so far it hasn't turned out that way. But clearly we look at the skill set that hasn't developed to the point that we would like it to develop. But there is a skill set there that's raw that has a higher ceiling than other skill sets.
And he hasn't played enough that it's not fair to say he's a finished product that didn't work out. Like,
right. You can't just be like, oh, well, that's obviously a bust. Boy, we got that one wrong. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Niners got that one wrong, reading the room of their current situation and their roster and what they were ready to do. Like, you're not in any kind of rebuilding mode. And I understand that he wanted to maybe look at the way that teams were defending him and say, like, I'd like to add an extra wrinkle and not just do the exact same offense moving forward. I'd like to add something here. But also, you have a team that is ready to win right now. And so there's a really short leash for a quarterback that needs to be developed, which we knew all along was Trey Lance. Like, he was never going to be a guy who was going to be a finished product as soon as he hit the field. Much like Anthony Richardson, right? Like Anthony Richardson, I love that swing for the fences pick for the Colts. I love it. I love it in fantasy, by the way. We can get to that. But I think that's one where you know
tons of college experience. You got to figure that you're going to take some time. And it's kind of a weird scenario for the 49ers that John Lynch and company are getting written about as if they could be executive of the year, when anybody else in this scenario would be fired immediately. Like, giving up that much
100%
a QB that didn't work out, it would be just it.
But also, they have one of the best rosters in the NFL.
That's why.
So there is I mean, I had people, because I've commented about the fact that I think this situation is weird that so many people are willing to give Trey Lance the benefit of the doubt and are like just aggressively in Team Lance, #Team Lance, right? And like going after the Niners. And I understand they deserve a lot of criticism with regard to the trade up in the first place. They gave up too much to move up. Considering they didn't even know who they were going to go get. Are you kidding me? Like, I never even believed that. And then to find out on the back end that was kind of true is just crazy to me. Like, the misuse of resources is bonkers. And you're right. If it didn't work out and it hamstrung the franchise moving forward, then we would be talking about them losing their jobs. The flip side of that, though, the problem, and what I've said to people is they're like, there's no evidence that they know how to do this. They've messed up so many times, drafted Trey Lance over Elijah Mitchell. Like, they get this wrong all the time. And I'm like, the only evidence that we know that they know how to do this is the fact that they have the best roster in the NFL. Like, what are you talking about?
And they're just in the NFC title game with Mr. Irrelevant. Like, it's almost a franchise that could argue, wow, every other team is saying you got to have a quarterback that's good enough in order to win. This is an era where you need a QB. They could say, not really. I mean, like, we don't. I mean, nothing. Nothing against Brock Purdy, but Mr. Irrelevant for a reason. Like, nobody thought he would do that right away. So they're able to and the Trey Lance story, I think, is going to be a movie someday if he never has an NFL career. Like, this guy's going to be on talk shows 20 years from now. How did this work for you?
Company that did Johnny Manziel's, what is that, Untold?
I did watch that the other day, but off the top of my head, this almost, and it didn't go in the same direction with hype, but it almost feels similar to like a Ryan Leaf scenario, and he has turned his life around and is doing that. He seems like a great dude. I've never talked to him yet, but he's now in that position, though. People are asking him and putting him on shows saying, how did this work for you? How did you get here? You almost don't want to have that be a situation for Trey, but maybe Ryan and Trey should become friends, because if Trey doesn't get on the field again, that maybe he's reached out, because that could go in that way. But there
are other examples too. Like Ryan's there were a lot of reasons, right? That had almost nothing to do with football and attitude and some other things like demons that he's dealing with off the field.
Open about,
From a Trey standpoint, I'm like, there are examples, and I haven't bothered to even go look for them, but I mean, they're plentiful, right? There are guys that are drafted that you could argue were overdrafted on the back end. That's another way of saying that they were a bust, but that didn't get on the field fast enough. When they were on the field early, like, they didn't do well, and so you couldn't keep them on the field. There are other examples that flame out faster in the NFL, and we blame them. we talk about them as being a bust. We attach that to them.
And never the team, right? Especially a lot of these franchises have these quote unquote busts for like 2, 3, 4, 5 years in a row. Maybe the blame is in the wrong direction because, as Ryan's talked about, it also is the situation you're in. I mean,
but also it's the opposite of what we're seeing in San Francisco, which is why the Trey Lance thing's so fascinating to me. Like no one is saying, or not no one, people are, but the conversation doesn't seem to be centered around like, man, it's a bummer that he didn't develop. Like they're seeing him every day in practice. They are the two people, John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan, that are the most invested in him succeeding in the NFL. Like there are reasons he's not starting for them. And that goes back. And again, I think they overdrafted him and thought that he could develop faster. And there were a lot of flaws in their process.
And
but
Kyle Shanahan's this offensive genius and he gave up on the guy. I mean, that's a factual thing now, whether he wanted to or not. So that's, So you don't really want to have Kyle Shanahan attached to giving up on you. That's not really a good vibe.
I know. Well, but at least in this situation, you can go, well, there's a shorter leash in San Francisco right now than there would be in other cities. Like I brought up Anthony Richardson, Indianapolis has signed up for and made statements that make me feel like they are self-aware of what they're in for this season. They know this is going to be a roller coaster. They are committed to writing it out and letting him develop. Like it's going to look good at times. And then it's going to look really ugly at times. I think it sounds like they're ready for that. And they're ready to work through his growing pains and get to a point where I think their thought is that the ceiling will make it worth it. And this isn't the year they're going to win the Super Bowl. This is the year they're trying to find out if they have a starting quarterback. And I think that they're committed to finding that out. And that it's not going to be a quick like, oh, hook, go to Gardner Minshew because we have to win this game against the Jaguars. Like, no, like, get your answer for your roster build. This isn't the year. We want to win as much as we can, but the most important thing is that we know what we're working with moving forward.
Yeah, Lindsay Rhodes here of Sirius XM Fantasy and talking some football, of course. And the message the teams send, I think, is very, very important. And we don't have time for this, but that goes back to the way Jerry Jones handled the situation with Trey Lance. Like, is that saying a message that's going to work with Dak? Because he comes off kind of mad about it. So like, how's that going to work? And maybe some have argued that he's maybe the one handling this improperly, that you're getting paid the big bucks. You don't deserve to be told you need to play better. So that exists too. But then you have the flip side of, say, how the Packers are handling Jordan Love. Every quarterback before him in the franchise the last 30 plus years has won a championship and an MVP multiple times over and is going to go to the Hall of Fame. So that's a lot of pressure for him. But it does feel like the Packers are at least sending the message that, hey, we're not expecting all of that to get done right now. So a lot is cast on him. He could be another pick. But I do want to get your thoughts here because I am in the Pittsburgh market. We did kind of briefly allude.
Steelers.
Yeah, we can. And there are a couple players here. People can bring up Kenny Pickett, although to be fair, it's only his second season. But if you want to bring up maybe a player with a little bit more seasoning who also was a first-round draft pick, Najee Harris is one people can bring up as well. And that also can even segue into a conversation about the running back position overall, because Najee Harris' contract clock is now ticking. It's the entire debate that was revving up here that maybe the Steelers shouldn't have drafted a running back then because they had no offensive line. And if you have a bad offensive line, a running back's only going to be there for a few years, and then almost no one signs the second deal, or else they want too much. They want to argue their receiver in arbitration. You don't want them anymore because you have a series of teams that have won championships without an elite running back. The whole argument exists then, and we're about a year away for Najee, who got better at the end of last year. Prior to that was really never elite. This team now feels like they can be a playoff team, but depends on how good Watson is and other pieces and how things work in the AFC. It's going to be loaded. Won't be easy to get there. But Najee needs to produce this year to have that argument next year, basically. If he comes off a bad year, then it won't be as much of a debate in his favor. So is he someone that is under pressure for you? Do you agree with all of that? And then what are your thoughts on Najee Harris and even the running back conversation in general in terms of, will the position ever be valued again, or are they kind of down a path where they're screwed here? Does anything need restructured in terms of rookie deals? Like, do they need to be 5-6 years long, or maybe even 1 or 2 years long to get them out quicker?
Yeah, let's start with Najee there. And I think that the running back conversation is one of the most fascinating things that's happening right now in the NFL for all the reasons that you said. My concerns with Najee are that his efficiency numbers are just bad. Like last year, they just were. Like you pull up advanced metrics and you look at people who are like rushing yards over expectation, right? Which is something that's supposed to factor in the entire circumstance. It's supposed to factor in the circumstances when the ball carrier gets the ball, rate of speed when the ball carrier gets the ball, where the blockers are, like what the situation is, and it's supposed to factor in how many yards you should get under these circumstances, and then the expectation is set, and then what you do. And his rushing yards over expectation were very low, like among some of the worst running backs in the NFL. And, average yards per carry also low, like the efficiency numbers weren't there. And I understand that there's that's one of those hard situations where you could look at like O-line, you could look at offensive scheme, you could look at all of these things and say, like, I don't know how much is on the running back and how much is on the set of circumstances around him. And I think that's hard. This is one of the things. There are so many, and I'm all over the place here, but there are so many different places, I think, in today's NFL content space that are exciting about people who are experts in various and very small things in the NFL that you can go to, like Matt Harmon from Reception Perception, who's charting all of the wide receivers and telling you, who's good versus man and who's good versus press and who's good versus zone and what routes they're good on and who's actually good, whether they're getting the ball and putting up numbers or not. The one thing I'm looking for is somebody who will do that at the running back position, because I think it's a really tough position to read, but like a rushing yards over expectation stat is supposed to factor all of those things in. I don't know how they put it together, but it's supposed to, and his numbers are not good. So I have slight concerns about Najee Harris, coupled with all of the Jaylen Warren stuff that we heard a little bit last year. We're hearing a little bit now. Like, is he going to be a factor in this offense, or is it going to be less of a bell cow situation and more of like a committee? Jaylen comes onto the field in certain situations and takes Najee off of it. I don't know. I think that Najee is in a position where he needs to get those numbers up this year, or find somebody to start, advocating for him about why those numbers aren't actually telling a story about a running back who is more highly thought of than his play would indicate,
Right. And the offensive line, the conversation around the O-line is that they're getting better. And they have a mobile quarterback now, because all of the offensive line at the time of the draft was coming off of an aging quarterback who couldn't move as well. The offensive line wasn't good. There were really no all-pros there. But to be fair to what you're saying, the Steelers knew all of that when they drafted a running back. So they drafted a running back arguably in a position where he wasn't going to be able to succeed unless he really was the best in the game. And maybe Najee was maybe was a bit overrated at the time coming out of Bama, because he's running in front of the best offensive line in college football. It's a little different. And even talking to him at camp his rookie year, he was talking about how, I don't care what the offensive line is like, I'm going to run through it. I can run through a brick wall. And we're all sitting there thinking, this is not a good mentality for a position that has a 4 or 5 year shelf life with an offensive line that is not good right now. You're not going to have a long career, bro. So he seemingly has adjusted a little bit, but he's also not been fully healthy. And I think especially if Kenny Pickett picks it up and becomes at least better than he was last year and becomes a legit franchise QB, then all the eyeballs would go right to Najee if that team struggles offensively in some way.
Totally. And then the problem at the running back position too is that you've got these guys in the first round where the expectations are very high. And then this is a position where it just is. You can pluck somebody that goes undrafted and put them in there and watch them have some degree of success. And there's a laundry list of examples there. I mean, you just have to go back as far as Tyler Algier last season. And I know that he wasn't one of those guys who was flashy or sexy or anything like that. And you could look at the Falcons and Tyler Algier's numbers and say, oh, he's propped up by volume because all they do there is run for some inexplicable reason when they have those passing game assets. But anyway, but Tyler Algier in all the advanced metrics, like if you go looking for it, you're like, no, it's not volume based. It's all, every time he gets a shot, like he's overreaching expectations. His rushing yards over expectation per attempt is at the top of the NFL with names that you would expect to be there, like Nick Chubb and Tony Pollard and And then there's Tyler Algier. Like there are guys who work their way into that conversation who seem to come out of nowhere. And to me, that drives the price of the running backs down because this almost feels like a bites at the apple type of situation.
Yeah.
Clearly, there are some guys whose skill set is a little bit more varied or extreme or versatile or something like that. You've got a Bijan Robinson and a Jameer Gibbs, and I'm really eager to see what they're able to do.
I thought it was kind of odd and curious, not to say he's not great. I cover the Big 12. I've seen him in person, but to get drafted in the first round in the midst of this conversation, it was almost like that's the opposite of what everyone else is saying you should do. You're still doing it. So he does have pressure right away to perform, but that was interesting. But a lot of it also is how the team is built. Like, I think part of this, and it's not happened yet, and I'm not necessarily telling the man how he should run his business, but in order for the running back position to ever maybe really fight this fight, Derrick Henry or somebody at that level is going to have to legit sit out games, like legit be willing to screw a team
did
almost.
Le'Veon did that at the height of his, and then it didn't go anywhere and didn't do anything, and the only person it hurt was Le'Veon.
That's true. Yeah, but like Saquon put his tail between his legs and agreed, because the issue is, even though all these incentives exist in these deals, and you hear all the time that, okay, Jonathan Taylor, he got to get tons of incentives and then he'll really show them. If it's a 1-year deal or a franchise tag with tons of incentives, you're not showing anybody anything. Like, teams are willing to pay for production for a year. They just don't want to lock into a 4-year deal with a running back. Clearly.
And the numbers show that there are a lot more reasons that they shouldn't than that they should.
Right. It's a business. You name me 4 that got better after 30 years old. It's like Adrian Peterson, and that's it.
Exactly. That's the problem.
On my last show, actually, I talked with Amon Green, and he feels that if the Packers would have kept him, he would have been able to put up those numbers, and he would have been able to show you and all. But it's like, he didn't in Houston, and Adrian Peterson just such a high bar. The Packers won a championship the year after saying, "We're done with you, Amon Green." So like, that example doesn't show, and really. If the last time an elite running back for me off the top of my head was on a Super Bowl team as one of the top 2 best players in that roster, probably Marshawn Lynch with Seattle. Like, that's probably how long ago it was. Every other year after that's it's been a series of running backs. You have the Rams. They go with Todd Gurley. He wants more money. They say, we don't really want to do it. They end up CJ Anderson off his couch, enough yards with everything else working, and they go ahead and win the Super Bowl. Like, that's not good for the position trying to argue for more money or longer term deals, I think, is the issue, or even guaranteed money, of course, that every player wants. That was Le'Veon Bell's whole thing. And he's come out and says he regrets, because the Steelers deal, actually, you could argue at the time, if he would have taken that, probably would have hurt the Steelers. Like, they're probably better off he didn't do it, because they were offering him a decent amount that he wanted more. Still.
Yeah. The running back situation is tricky, because I think we all want people to be treated the way that we would want to be treated. And in these situations, if we were all running backs and we were at the top of our field and they're like, sorry, like, we're just not going to pay you. Like, you still have value to us. It's just, we don't have to pay you. And they don't have to. They really don't. The way that the system is structured, and you asked about answers and like what they should do to change. I don't know those answers right now. I just don't know. I don't know that there's a clear-cut path forward for how to fix this for the running backs. But I mean, if I was a team and I was a general manager, I can't tell you that I wouldn't do exactly what they're doing, because they have the right to tag the player, and then they have the right to tag them again. And then the third time, maybe it doesn't become a smart financial move. And so maybe you don't, but like, if it's built into the system that you can, and everything tells you that the examples of teams that have success and make it to the end of the postseason, they don't have these star running backs. So it doesn't actually matter for your build in terms of where you're prioritizing money, but also all of the numbers show that after a certain number of years, they're going to go like this, and actually probably closer to like that quickly, that there's going to be a drop off. Even if you're a super high end running back, it's going to go over a cliff. Then you don't want to be stuck holding the bag when it goes over the cliff. So I think this is the way that they're going to keep doing it. I don't think it's a bad way. It sucks for the people.
And in business, what's the motivation to go all of a sudden be the GM or owner to like fight the good fight and just throw cash at a running back when no one else is doing it. Everyone else is having success not doing it.
Right.
There's no motivation to be that guy and be that crusader. Really, it's going to, again, have to be a running back that somehow sets this. But I guess then I'll ask you, as maybe a better way of asking the question on where this goes from here. Do you think, number one, the NFL should or needs to care about this at all? Because they do normally sometimes care about PR, and these are star players that are very now vocal, feeling like they're being treated unfairly, whether it be fantasy, which is now obviously a big deal for the NFL, and money going around and betting, and even these players and these teams. And there are some teams that are built where the running back's the MVP. The Giants with Saquon, obviously Derrick Henry, and the Titans are another example. So it's out there. So should the NFL care? Do you think they care? And then does this in any way lead us down a path that maybe the NFL structure and model needs investigated? Because in comparison to the other major sports leagues, even though the hard cap has created parity, these franchise tags, you could argue, are unfair across the board to players separate from even running back. Like Travis Kelce, for example, best tight end, but his numbers also say he's a top 5 receiver in the game, if not top 3.
Right.
But the franchise tag is going to max him out at a certain level for tight ends when he's going to say, I'm not only am I better than all these guys, I'm also better than receivers who you have a higher cap for. So is this going to send us down a path that, like, Travis Kelce, if he's ever franchise tagged, which probably won't happen, could maybe force the NFL to do something different? Or is it just going to be a life that's unfair to running backs? Because that could be the situation too. The running back used to be a major position in the league. That kind of went away. But
it could cycle back, because there are some things
back,
like the NFL does go in cycles. You're always looking for a way to how are the other teams built? If you're a team like the Falcons, I think are a perfect example of this to a degree. You look at your roster and say, okay, where do we have an advantage? Like, what are we better at? Well, we're not at quarterback, right? Like for the last few years, they just haven't, that's not the way that they're built. So how can we create an advantage? Let's look at the defenses that we're facing. What are they good at? And one of the things that is clear in the last few years from a defensive standpoint is that rosters have started to be built differently. You don't have those big space eaters in the middle the way that you used to on the defensive line. Like we've seen the bodies change up front. And that is because they're built to stop the pass. If you stop the quarterback, then you stop everything. So they're all slimmer so that they can go rush the quarterback.
Look at Aaron Donald, arguably the best ever. Very small in comparison to back in the day. Yeah.
But you don't have those run stuffers that we once did. So if you're a team like the Falcons and you look at your roster and you say, we are undermanned comparatively, well, then strategically, the smart thing to do is to say, what are they good at? So what are they less good at? Let's attack that. And so to a degree, you could look at them and say, like, there's a strong argument to be made for it being smart for that specific roster to run the ball as frequently as they did, because the defenses aren't as built to stop it. So now you're just minimizing the ways in which the other team has an advantage over you. So I think that if enough teams started building their roster to attack that, then you'd start seeing defenses built there. Like in those ways, I think roster building can become cyclical. I think now that analytics is a part of the game, I find it hard to believe that running backs will ever go back to being as valued as they once were, just because of the law of averages and efficiency. You know, like it's obvious that if you take 3 shots downfield and one of them hits, you know, that you've just moved the ball a lot farther than you probably would have even with 3 successful runs. Right. 4 yards, you know, like,
if you gain, 6 yards on a series, thanks to 2 running backs, that's still 6 yards, whether it be off of 2 running backs getting paid a lot less or one man getting the bag. Like, you don't need to give one man the bag to get the production that 2 other guys who are getting league minimum could potentially give you. That's kind of the issue they're in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. That's for sure. I did talk to Terrell Davis earlier this week. We did an event together. And one of the things that he brought up that I thought was worthwhile putting in the back of our minds, but this only applies to certain teams, I think, is that he said, so he was a guy who was an undrafted rookie, came into camp as like 7th on the depth chart. He said, I don't know if that's actually true. 7 running backs. Anyway, he said he's last on the list. And then he works his way into the starting job, to start the season, which is just a bonkers ascent. Yeah. So he does that, plays that year as a rookie. He's good. Mike Shanahan ripped up his contract. And he said he didn't have to rip up my contract. He could have just said, I have you under contract and you're going to play. And that's maybe even a smart business decision. And if
in this day and age, it wouldn't get ripped up. I think that's right.
That's what I said. That's what I said to him too. I'm like, they wouldn't have done that now. But he did do that then. And you could even argue now, looking back, that might have been a bad business decision because TD didn't play a very long career. But what he did say is he's like, people ask me all the time in that Super Bowl game when I had the migraine and I couldn't see, like, how did you go in? Why did you go in? Like, why did you risk it? Why did you push so hard? I mean, in addition to it being the Super Bowl, he said he looked down the sideline, he saw Mike Shanahan, and he said, I can't let that man down. Yeah. He felt so loyal to him that he pushed himself further than maybe he would have in a different situation because he just felt a sense of loyalty that I think is lost in this situation. There's no doubt that Josh Jacobs is not going to look down the line and go, Josh McDaniels, I got to do it. Warm fuzzy. He's going to be like double birds, but I'm going to be good for me. You know, it's a different way of approaching it.
Yeah. And Saquon Barkley has already kind of dropped subtle hints that, like, if I'm not fully healthy here, like, I'm not feeling it all the time. So,
but the problem with that, if you don't have a long-term deal, is that then we'll go, see?
Right.
They get hurt so much. Like, they're the only 100%. Position that can't afford to be over on the bike. They can't.
Right. Yeah, you can't. You have to max out. And you also need a whole nother conversation, too, that exists that you need to, if you're playing a running back position, even at an elite level, you need to make sure you invest and keep your money and don't waste it all because you can't afford to do that in that position. Unlike, say, a quarterback that even if you're, halfway decent, you're going to accrue a solid bank account for many, many years because that's just the way the position works. So, yeah, it is Lindsay Rhodes here again of Sirius XM Fantasy, joining me here on Mic Drop on Believe, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn. And we're talking some football, and it does seem like a conversation that's never going to not only die out, but I don't see a fix. Like, Terrell Davis is a perfect example and someone to talk to, honestly, because the previous era when running backs were the elite MVP, that was when he was at his best. And he really basically helped an aging quarterback change his legacy and get some championships. Yeah. And a lot of people could thank him directly if they're in the Hall of Fame or that they're already there. And that era is really gone now. Maybe Marshall Faulk a little bit after him. But since that time, it's all about the QB, and they feel like they can get it done. Maybe could even blame Bill Belichick in a way because they ran that dynasty without really ever an elite running back, except for maybe Corey Dillon for a year. He basically was like,
now they're going to run it with nothing. They have one quarterback.
Right. They don't even care about an offensive coordinator now. And that was last year's whole thing. And that's a whole nother conversation. And maybe Belichick's a little arrogant, but the rings show that it's working, obviously, or at least it worked in the past with the 6 rings. But I do want to ask you, because we talked Najee Harris and how that segued into the running back conversation. What are your thoughts on Kenny Pickett? Now, this is the only first-round quarterback of that draft. Mike Tomlin's admitted that they kind of maybe fell in love with him more than other teams would have because they could watch him every day at practice and do it legally because Pitt and Steelers shared a facility. So they were always in love with Pickett. I believe the conspiracy theory out there, as someone who covered the Steelers, that they never believed he was going to be available and they had all different mindset. And then once he was there, they threw it away and said, we can't avoid this man because they wouldn't have got Trubisky prior to that if they probably thought they were jumping in the Pickett business since they're so in love with him. But at the end of the day, they ended up with Pickett, fell to them, played last year, played okay, but they kind of won in spite of him. And there's such a Pickett phenomenon going on in Pittsburgh because he is a Pitt product as well, that there are people that if he doesn't have a great career will blame everyone else but Kenny Pickett.
Really?
There also are other people because the area is a melting pot that there are a lot of Pitt fans, but there's also a lot of Penn State and West Virginia fans that don't like Pitt. And that segment of the fan base is going to probably secretly root against Kenny Pickett. I feel like that's going on. So he's in a really unfortunate situation because he's also the quarterback of the Steelers, who's following a Hall of Famer, who's also speaking out publicly about Pickett and saying he didn't really root for him initially. So it's like all going at him. But yet there are signs from camp that he is going to be a lot better. George Pickens looks like he's way better, maybe one of the best receivers in all of football. The O-line's better. Najee could be better. There are a lot of things going for Pickett, but also a lot of pressure on the outside going against him. It's very weird. And it seems like the opinions of Pickett are all over the place. Of people who think he's way overrated, people who think he's way underrated. but he's a first-round quarterback, so the pressure has to exist of what a first-round quarterback will give you.
I mean, my guess is that none of those people, I mean, look, this is what we love about sports is everybody gets to have an opinion. You watch as much as you watch, as little as you want to watch, and then everybody gets to have an opinion. The truth is we don't know, but there were some good signs down the stretch for Kenny Pickett, right? Last 6 games of the season, he was the 3rd highest graded quarterback, according to PFF, whatever you make of PFF grades, but that's still impressive, right? Like that's an indicator that he was doing things well. He had the 3rd highest big time throw percentage. He had the lowest turnover worthy play rate, only took 4 sacks in that time. His pressure to sack rate was the 4th lowest, 10th most first downs. Pulling up my Kenny Pickett notes here, obviously for you. But I mean, there are signs that he was doing things well that are an indicator of whether or not somebody's going to be a good quarterback, right? Like those aren't things that somebody who is not going to develop is going to do well. There are things that you can take away from all of those numbers that would indicate like there's something that we can build on here. And the numbers weren't flashy and it was a low volume passing offense. And certainly you have assets in that passing game that you would like that not to be the case. Like Deontay Johnson, we would like to get him in the end zone. That would be nice, right? Like talk about positive regression, like to the moon, dude. I hope he score every touchdown this year. But Kenny Pickens too. George Pickens. This Pickett and Pickens in the same offense thing is just fun. But George Pickens, I like what I'm hearing about him during training camp because I think
he's caught some Randy Moss balls. I'll easily explain it that way. That's exactly what it looks like.
The thing is he has insane athleticism and elite body control and that kind of stuff, right? Like that and that's something that you can't necessarily teach. And so that's awesome that we saw that. The thing that's tricky about that is that you can see that and go, he's such a good receiver. But what's part of being a receiver is being able to run the whole route tree crisply and be where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there, exactly when you're supposed to be there, turn exactly when you're supposed to turn. And there were a lot of people that I talked to last year who watched the tape much more closely than I do and know what things should look like more so than I do, who said he was out of position, he was sloppy, he didn't do a lot of those things. So from a receiver standpoint and being a well-rounded receiver, he wasn't there yet. Like he was just a guy who was sort of raw with a huge skill set, like the ceiling's really, really high. What I've loved that I've heard about him in training camp and in the preseason is how much he's developed those aspects of his game. The fact that he looks a lot better in those specific areas.
And he's aware of it and willing to work on those things despite on all the highlight reels. Like you could easily get an ego and be like, I'm good. Right.
It's not just Kenny Pickett, right? Like, because Kenny Pickett could throw the ball exactly where it's supposed to go. And if he's not where he's supposed to be, it looks like Kenny Pickett missed by, 2 feet or whatever. Like, what an awful throw. We don't know. We don't know. So I think it's important. I think all of these things work together. And I think we all have faith in Mike Tomlin to get the most out of this team. I don't know if people in Pittsburgh are like, because I always think it's funny.
I don't know if we all have faith, but maybe they should. But unfortunately, they don't all have the faith.
This is the funniest part to me is I think fan bases that are super passionate are the hardest people on that team, but also don't want to hear you be hard on them at all. It's like I can talk trash on my mom, you are not allowed to type of thing.
That's a great, and that's pretty much how it is. I feel like that's correct. Yes.
But so as soon as I said that, I was like, I bet you this is exactly the place in the world where people actually don't think Mike Tomlin's that guy anymore. Because I look at like Niners conversations and the way that people talk about Shanahan, and then you've got like Ohio State and they want to get rid of Ryan Day, and I'm just like, what are we doing here, guys? Do you know how the other half lives?
There's a whole segment of Steeler fans that absolutely are legitimately upset about the whole thing of not having a losing season. There are some Steeler fans that wish they would have had a losing season 3-4 years ago because they feel like they then would have been better off to now, and that's why there's only one championship, because they were never able to have a losing season to really cash in the chips. That is an opinion that exists, and that's out there, but the Steelers, like, they're going to put it on the Hall of Fame plaque. The Steelers are all about that not having a losing season thing, and I think it does annoy a segment of the fan base. That exists. That is an opinion that's out there.
I can relate to that from a fan standpoint, although coming at it from a very different point of view. I'm a USC fan. That's where I went to school.
Okay. Okay.
The coach that was there prior to our coach right now,
Yeah.
I was like, let's lose some games. Let's get this thing done. Let's wrap this up. Like not to,
Right.
I mean, that sounds so callous and mean. I don't want anyone to lose their jobs, but I was like, this isn't working. Like we can all see this isn't working. So let's just cut bait with it rather than get just enough wins to go to a bowl game. Like I don't want to go to a bowl game. I want to win a national championship. I'm a bratty fan. That's who I am. If you're not in the championship game or like trying to get to that national championship game, then you are not worth my time on Saturdays. I'm busy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, 100%. There's some pumpkin patches to go to or something. Yeah, like
what?
Yeah, like in the fall. I was kind of I was connecting the dots to the fall. But
I've got a lot of pumpkin patches to go to.
Not in LA, I guess. But okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like they're 100%, especially in Los Angeles. There's a lot of other things to do. So that exists. That opinion definitely exists, and there's a pressure there, and really could even connect the dots to the pressure maybe being on Matt Canada because there's no one in Pittsburgh that likes him. And whether that's fair or not, because of the O-line being so bad and an aging quarterback is immaterial, he's still there. Yeah. I never thought the Steelers I think also what people don't get, the Steelers they just operate differently. Like they're not going to bring a guy in and fire him after 1 year. They just won't do it. They always give you time. They don't fire head coaches at all. They just have not. So Mike Tomlin's going to be able to walk away if ever he would have a losing season. Like they're not going to fire him. There are Steeler fans that kind of want the Steelers to operate like other franchises, but they just aren't. They're going to do the Steeler thing. So for better or worse, the Steeler way is going to be how the Steelers operate until there's somebody who owns the franchise with a different last name, which I don't foresee happening for quite some time. So
tell me this. This is something I'm gonna interview you.
You can go ahead.
What about the Steelers defense this year? Because defense is so volatile and it's like all over the 100%. Map. I think it's much harder to predict than offense. And I don't know what to expect from the Steelers defense. Are they going to be good?
I think they're going to be better. I do think that people don't realize the Steelers defense was not that good the last couple of years. Like you have TJ Watt, you collect individual hardware. There are name players. Cam Hayward's still getting it done. But that defense held that team back at times the last couple of years. They were a bend and also break a lot of the time.
Not a great combo.
And having a veteran presence there now, and Patrick Peterson, who I've talked to a bunch, he's very interested in talking to the media and kind of explain to them how he's the coach of this team now, and he wants to be there with Mike Tomlin and wants this defense to be good. So it's another mouthpiece in addition to Cam Hayward for that defense, but the defense has had an issue with being healthy. The defense has had an issue with depth. The defense has had an issue with giving up too many yards. They really have not been able to stop the run well the last couple of years, which is mind-blowing for Steelers defense. So I think they're going to be better in all of that. I don't buy into the Steelers defense going to be as good as maybe you're hearing nationally or some excitement that exists out there. I think the Steelers defense still could have some problems because I'm almost figuring, just by law of averages, TJ is going to miss a couple games. Cam's going to miss a couple games. Patrick Peterson's probably going to miss a couple games. Like it's the NFL. When you get to a certain age, you miss games, and those guys have been missing games, and maybe they relied on too much. So that'll be interesting, and especially secondary wise, if the Steelers have enough there in terms of depth. But I would not be shocked if there are defensive issues right away, and the Steelers' schedule does not get easy right away. So they may benefit on the offense I do think the offense is going to be a lot better overall, whether Pickett gets better or not. So that maybe indirectly helps the defense a little bit. But Lindsay Rhodes here joining me on Mic Drop. So I do want to get, because you're a fantasy expert, I do want to get your thoughts fantasy-wise before I let you go here. And now you're getting really excited. So we talked some pressure cooker players, but what's some fantasy advice out there that maybe you have that you think people just are still not grasping when they go into these drafts? There are people maybe still drafting running backs, and we're talking about value of the position. So whatever people are still doing that, you're sitting there in a draft thinking, man, like this is either what you should have done 5 years ago, or you're not getting it, or you're not listening to my show. Maybe you should be listening to my show more. Like obviously. So what's some advice out there that you want to give people in their fantasy drafts?
I think there are two main themes to this season that are different than in years past. For me, anyway, I have always been, you touched on one of them, a running back truther. Like, I like to get those running backs in the early rounds. We all know there isn't that much positional depth there. And that's why running backs have been so valuable in fantasy, like since the dawn of time. Um, I don't think that that's the case anymore this year. Okay. And I think partially it's because of all of the things that we already talked about with regard to how the running back position is being treated. There are fewer feature back positions around the NFL. Like, you're not looking at as many bell cow backs as we have in years past. There's a lot of running back by committee, which devalues people just inherently because they're not going to be on the field as much with as much opportunity. And then it's a weird pivot point year at the position, in my opinion, in that the guys that are going early that we've been able to count on for the last handful of years to go in that first round at running back, they're now at that turning point in their career where they're just a little bit too old, or their roles have now changed. And so you don't really know who is going to get the volume, like who you can count on that doesn't have a question mark, because you don't want volatility.
Or they're in contract disputes, and then you don't know how those things go. Or
this Jonathan Taylor thing snuck up on me. I didn't expect him to start the season on PUP. I didn't think he was going to get traded either, but I thought that the injury was fake. I mean, I think we all thought the injury was fake, right?
Eventually, like Saquon, like he wanted to be traded. It didn't happen. He wanted more money. It didn't happen. There wasn't value out there, but he'd eventually just play week one and we'll figure something out. But
me too.
He appears like that. The stubbornness on both sides. Maybe like the two stubborn heads, it almost seems like they have come together and there is no way to fix this. That seems like that's where we are in Indianapolis right now.
But even before that, and this is obviously the main thing, like now we don't even know when he's going to be on the field. And you don't want to draft somebody high that you're not going to have for the first 4 games. So like that's going to push you down the board, just that alone. But even in addition to that, part of the thing that's factoring into his contract situation is, dude, it wasn't good last year. Like, it wasn't. And I know that the whole thing wasn't good and the O-line was inexplicably bad and the quarterback was not great. And like everything was bad. And that leads to a bad situation. And it makes it harder for you to be good. But also like he was the number 1 fantasy pick and he finished like something in the 30s or whatever at the position. Like, it was awful. It was
at
awful.
That position. Any agent would tell you got to have the stats for me to argue. Like, that's what we said about Najee. Like, I don't care what else is going on. Even if Matt Canada's, drawing sweeps every play and they're stacking the box. Like, you got to figure it out or else you can't get in the room and argue next year because they don't want to pay that position anyway.
And the lines coming out of Indy were, I'm sure, carefully chosen and purposeful. And they were like, I look forward to him getting back on the field and proving that he can be the guy that he was 2 years ago. Like, they specifically were like sending a message like, you weren't that guy last year. You want us to pay you like the guy from 2 years ago. And we know it's a possibility because we've seen it before, but we also know now that this is a possibility and I don't want to pay you for that. So I think that that's the tricky thing about fantasy with the running back position, is that there's so much volatility with regard to those guys at the top. And even like a guy like Saquon, who had a few really good games, also had a handful of games where he was just underwhelming for your fantasy teams. So you're going to go all in on that? Like, that's going to be how you build your team. So what we're seeing this year and what I am doing this year, which is something I've never done before, is really prioritize wide receivers in the first couple of rounds. I want to leave every draft with at least 2 high-end wide receivers. And in the first round, I'm really trying to get a wide receiver because if you can get like one of those high-end guys, JJ at number 1 and Jamar Chase at number 2 in a single quarterback league are the easiest picks of the draft. It gets a little bit harder for me at number 3, whether you go CMC or whether you unknot the tie between Cooper Kupp or Tyreek Hill. But for me, I would rather have like 20 points a game and know that there's going to be some consistency. There's less volatility at the wide receiver position once you are talking about the elite wide receivers. I don't want you to take my squad, barring injuries off the table, because that's going to happen to everyone, except for in the case of Christian McCaffrey, where you're like, you got through a season last year healthy, but you didn't the 2 years prior. There's part of me that's like, law of averages thinks I'm going to get screwed this year if I draft you. So that's the only knock on Christian McCaffrey, but he's still going really, really high. Everyone else has a question mark attached to him in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, Cooper Kupp even has a question mark because people think the Rams aren't going to be very, very good and could start trading some of these players. And Matt Stafford, maybe he's going to retire in a year or two. Like, then that affects you as a receiver. Like, this all does connect. So...
But even in the case of Cooper Kupp, he was on a bad team last year.
Right.
Matthew Stafford was all over the map. His numbers were still excellent. His target share is insane.
Right.
His all of these numbers still led to fantasy production for him. So even if the situation's bad, the one person I think that can make it through that unscathed is probably Cooper Kupp. Like, if you don't have any other options, what are you going to do? First read, Cooper Kupp, where are you? Go get him the ball. Does he have the skill set to get it? Even if he's got 2 defenders on him, he does. So that's good.
Right.
Anyway, point being, wide receivers early. I think that's the strongest build. Okay. There are a handful of running backs in the middle rounds, and you'll be able to see when that tier's coming up, like an Alexander Madison and a Miles Sanders and a James Conner, and guys that are in situations where they're not sharing the backfield with other people. They do kind of have feature back roles. They're just not as talented as everybody else. But fantasy is all about opportunity. You're chasing the opportunity. You're not chasing the points. So in that sense, you could get those guys in that range, and it's not going to look super sexy when you look at your roster. But if you have a wide receiver in your wide receiver spot and you've got a wide receiver in your flex spot and they're all really good, it's going to boost your average score. The other thing this year that I'm doing differently is I've always been a wait on a quarterback person, and I'm not really doing that this year.
I was almost going to go there. Yeah, we're reading each other's minds here. I feel like.
I'm not I'm not taking one in the first round. I'm not going to do that. Okay. And in fact, I have a very specific tier situation in the quarterback.
Do you feel like, because I kind of do you feel like people are reaching for, I got to have Aaron Rodgers, or I got to have the Patrick Mahomes or sexy QB, when you don't need that to have a fantasy championship team, based on what kind of you're saying?
To a degree.
Okay.
To a degree, but I think that what happened last year is that I know that what you could do is you could say the number 1 quarterback scores this many, like at tight end, right? You could definitely make the argument Travis Kelce in the first round is a smart call. He scored 100 more fantasy points than number 2 at the position group last year. We're not talking about 1 point a game. I can make that up elsewhere. We're talking about a massive drop off.
Yeah.
But at quarterback, that's always been the thing. Number 1 to number 12, it's not that dramatic. But the thing with that was that last year, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, those are guys who score in the high end every single week, consistently. They're not bad. They don't have bad weeks, and they're not putting up stinkers. They are constantly putting up these high numbers.
100%.
So, and then there's some other quarterbacks that I think there's a tier of 3, and then it drops to 8. There's 5 more guys after that, and then it drops, in my opinion. So you've got after those 3, then I would hit pause for a second if they're gone and I haven't had a chance to grab one of those. And by the way, my strategy for those is to just go with the flow of the draft. Don't reach, don't start it. I'll never crack it open. I'm never going to have the first quarterback. But because for me, on that tier of 3 guys, all of them are same. If I had the number 1 pick in a super flex draft, I hate that spot because now I'm just throwing a dart and I don't care. I'd rather have 3. I'd rather
someone's gonna crack the can. You don't need to be the guy or girl.
Exactly.
Someone's gonna do it. Someone will reach for one of them, and it'll ruin their whole board because after they reach, they're gonna sit there 2-3 rounds later and be like, I messed the whole thing up. Probably
that wide receiver was there, and I could have got this guy 3 rounds later. That's the guy that's
losing players right before he picks, and every single he finishes the draft saying, "Oh, I would have had all these players, but right before it's because you messed up your first round selection." Yeah.
So I'll take the third of those guys. If it just comes to me that way, if the first 2 are already gone and it comes to me on the snake, then I'll take the third of those guys.
Okay.
Not all the time, but sometimes if we're in a place that I feel comfortable doing that, then then there's Lamar and Justin and Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert. And then last for me, and by the way, those other 4 are kind of interchangeable too amongst that tier. And then last in that group is Trevor Lawrence for me. And then there's the drop off to Deshaun and Dak.
Out of all the ones you listed, I would say for the casual fan, Herbert probably is their last pick. That might be the best one to have. I mean, that might be a fine draft pick that'll get you just as many points as anybody else, and then you could really set the board. That'll be a great quarterback, honestly, and even if he's 6th or 7th on that list.
The problem with him last year was the volatility, and people who had him down the stretch, he was gross in the playoffs, in the fantasy playoffs. He had single-digit performance, and you're like, well, he's not going to do that again. And then, guess what? He totally did that again the next week. So he crushed some of my teams. I'm a big Justin Herbert fan. I think the skill set's insane. But I think if he throws the ball downfield a lot more this year, I think the offense will just be better. I think it was a train wreck in terms of all the things that could go wrong from a luck standpoint. They just did for them. And then now new offensive coordinator. We don't need to go through the whole Chargers situation, but I think there's reason to be optimistic about Justin Herbert again. And if we get burned again, then maybe we pivot away for a hot minute.
Right.
I don't have that many
Right.
shares of Justin Herbert, but that's because I'm really hard on I like Lamar. I like Justin Fields. I like the rushing quarterbacks. And then honestly, if it gets past that, I'm kind of okay waiting, grabbing Anthony Richardson when he comes around, and then just backing him up with somebody that will have a lower ceiling, but maybe be consistent. Like a Jared Goff. Jared Goff's actually not consistent,
but like that does sound like a risky selection.
But I think he's the type of skill set that he has is league winning. Like I think he's the guy that think of the way that Justin Fields was used down the stretch last year, right? Like he put up 30 plus points multiple back-to-back weeks.
Yeah, he could have a big year. There are people that believe that.
He proved that you can be a shitty passer and still be really good in fantasy because of what he does on the floor raises. I mean, what he does on the floor raises your floor. Like what he does on the ground just raises, like it's so valuable in fantasy and I think Justin Fields will take a next step forward. Like this is where we were about Jalen Hurts at this time last year. We were like, boy, I don't know if he develops as a passer, it could all come together. And it did. So I'm not saying Justin Fields is going to take that type of step, or certainly that the Bears won't. It's not the same organization. But from a fantasy standpoint, the floor is here because he can run with the ball and he's going to do it. Like you'd be stupid to not have him do it, Matt Nagy. But I think the same is true for Anthony Richardson. I think that his floor is always going to be higher than like a Bryce Young or a CJ Stroud, even if they're playing better quarterback than he is early on.
Yeah.
And then there will be volatility with his passing game. But if the passing game hits, well, then the sky's the limit. Now you've got like a potential number 1 overall fantasy quarterback. Now you've got top 5 potential. Like Justin Fields finished really high and he was a bad passer. So that's why
Lindsay Rhodes dropping the knowledge here on Mic Drop. You said 3 pieces of advice though. What's the third then?
Oh, I think did I say 3? The 2. There are 2 storylines. It was the quarterbacks and then not the running backs. I'm not waiting on the quarterbacks, and I am going wide receiver early. Those are the 2 things that I think are very different from the way I've approached drafts in the past that I think don't have to be rules that you followed this year.
Okay. That all makes sense, and I will use that in my draft later this evening. And really the last thing I do want to get your thoughts on, and it could have been touched on in terms of a player that has pressure, but maybe he doesn't, and it does appear that it's all singing Kumbaya right now, but who knows how it's going to go. And that's Aaron Rodgers with the Jets. Like, are you slurping the Kool-Aid of the Jets having this sexy season that leads them to a conference championship appearance or more? And Aaron Rodgers is now relaxed permanently, and he's not even going to yell at any more teammates. He won't blame anybody else. It'll just be all on him, and he just is greatest guy. Or that we're eventually going to see maybe what annoyed some people about Aaron Rodgers before, and maybe the Jets' hard schedule is going to come up and bite them, and it's going to be difficult. Like, where are you? Because that's a polarizing team. That's a team that's going to be heavily scrutinized and covered this year. But it's really almost Super Bowl or bust when you have Aaron Rodgers. And even though he says he's going to play 2 years, personally, I believe nothing until it actually occurs when it comes to Aaron Rodgers. So we'll see. But the Jets are obviously that melting pot team, and they've been on reality TV to show that.
I think that I was not excited about the move. I thought people were overreacting when he first signed with them. Because I had concerns about his demeanor, about his ability to connect with teammates, about outside of the football stuff, I think some of the stuff that we saw from him in Green Bay, you're like, I get where it's coming from. I understand being mad at your employer and feeling disrespected and not wanting to go,
in the Jordan Love selection, he won 2 MVPs afterwards, so I could get that too.
Totally. I mean, the Packers blew this with Aaron Rodgers. They own at least part of the responsibility here. I didn't love some of the, it's like, just stupid stuff where like if he overthrows or not overthrows, like Christian Watson early in the season dropped the ball and he's a rookie and that's going to happen. Like it just is. And then you see Aaron Rodgers go like, and I'm like, you're on camera, like just help him out, like build him up in those moments so that then at the end of the year, this is like week 3, dude, like at the end of the year, you have worked on your connection with him where he's not afraid to make a mistake. And now you can kind of like build these pieces around you. If not for any other reason than selfishly, you need them to be better, like help them be better.
There was a vibe around Aaron that either he didn't want to be there anymore because he never could get over the draft pick scenario and he just was in his feelings like a bitter ex for 3 years, or he thought he was above all of it. Like, he does have the complex where the vibe that exists around Aaron, I think people that maybe don't like him feel like he comes off like he's the smartest guy in the room. And you should be blessed to be even on his team or near his presence. And like, that is a situation that I think it doesn't have to be that way when you're a Hall of Fame QB. Like, there are players that are not near as good as Tom Brady, but would have ran through a wall for the man because he treated them all like they were family members of his, even though they weren't, to his level, obviously, in terms of legacy. But it wasn't that feeling with Aaron, but now it is, apparently, in New York. So,
but I think we can all relate to, like, all of this is to say, like, I didn't like what I saw from Aaron. I thought he was super annoying last year. Okay, full disclosure. That said, at the exact same time, I fully understood why he was that way and how he got to be that point. And I relate to that in ways that are like, like, I didn't love the way that, at the end of my time at NFL Network was treated. Like, I've got some feelings, like there's, some like, so I understand feeling like that and feeling like, dude, I've done so much for you.
You didn't give the vibe on air, by the way, though.
Thanks.
Towards the end, like, you didn't give the vibe on air that Aaron was giving the vibe.
There you go.
Seeing from Aaron. So maybe that's a
try
thing.
To be careful about it.
Right.
But I think we've all been in situations like that where you can understand, like, you're like, I gave everything to this and I didn't like the way that, once it turned for you and whatever reason it turned for you, that it was a smarter business decision to do something different or whatever, like, all of a sudden I'm dead to you. Or in this case, like, you don't think that I deserve just to be treated like an adult in the room? Like, just consult with me. Like, no, I'm giving you my everything. Just check the box every once in a while. Humor me. Pretend like I matter, Like, when we all know that I matter. In the case of Aaron Rodgers, I'm speaking for Aaron Rodgers now. That said, the video of him at the Taylor Swift concert kind of turned me. Did you see the video of him at the Taylor Swift concert?
I did, and I find it's almost like Taylor Swift is running the world. Like, she's turning people's opinions on Aaron Rodgers. But
she is. More power to her. I actually went to the concert with my daughter. It was like it was insane. But I haven't seen him that happy in a long time. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what it's like for Aaron Rodgers to be happy. And I think we're seeing more of that. And so that's thawed me a little bit of my original sense of, like, I don't know if he can walk into that locker room and do anything. I think he's just so bitter at this point and kind of like curmudgeon-y that it's not going to work.
And let's be honest, I mean, media is different these days, but still, like, that media market. I mean, just the local media is 10 times bigger than everybody else. Plus, you get national coverage because you're New York. So it's different than playing in Green Bay. Like, there's no media member in New York that's going to sit there and have private, work with Aaron and be like, you're a certain way, but I'm going to, spin the narrative in your favor like they would in Green Bay. In New York, they're going to sit there and say, if you're giving me this, I'm going to, like, when you sit there in a press conference and say you're the smartest guy in the room, there's a member of the Jets media that's thinking, I'm going to go at him and then go viral and then make my career. Whereas in Green Bay, they're not doing that. So like, that's, I don't think, so I did think, like, Aaron doesn't know what he's getting into. Aaron doesn't know what he's getting into here. Like, but
maybe he does, because he's kind of turned it around in terms of the way he's approached the whole thing.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
Smiley Aaron is winning a whole lot of
kissing him with kindness.
Yes,
but is it fake or is it not? And we might find out. That's the thing. Like, if they go 0-2 because the schedule is really tough, Aaron's going to have to answer these questions. And I think when you're a quarterback too, he's going to have to. What's annoyed me about Aaron Rodgers throughout his career, I'll put this out there in full disclosure. He's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. But when you're a QB and your team loses a big playoff game that Aaron's certainly familiar with doing in recent years, you need to go out there and say, I wasn't enough. You need to take it as the QB, even if it's not your fault. Like, you need to take it. He just would never do that. The vibe was never, there was always an excuse there of this play call, or this player did this, or this happened, or they didn't give me enough. And even the whole thing of I didn't get enough, he had the best receiver in football for many of those years when he was saying he didn't have enough around him. Like, so that vibe of Aaron just always rubbed me the wrong way of like Eli Manning, for example. He doesn't have the legacy of career of Aaron Rodgers, despite him winning one more ring, but he always would go out there and take everything, like all the time. Aaron just didn't give that vibe.
I think especially in the last few years, though, that was because he felt insecure with the way he was being treated by the people in the organization, and he wasn't going to give them that. Like, he was like, I think he probably felt like they thought that.
But if you're a teammate of his, wouldn't you say, like, even a teammate of yours, like in media, probably were thinking,
dude, you're
like,
Aaron Rodgers.
Or like thinking, like,
take it.
If you acted like Aaron, maybe at the end of NFL Network, I'm sure there would have been some some teammates of yours that would have been like, I get maybe you're in your feelings, but like you're now hurting me because you're criticizing me indirectly when you're upset here in this press conference or in this interview. It almost, that might be right if you want to psychoanalyze, but it almost is like Aaron in his head was thinking, my goal is me, myself, and I, and I'm in my feelings. So I'm going to make the Packers look bad subtly. And if that, pisses off my teammates, I don't care. That was kind of how he came off.
Also, just like tip to young quarterbacks, wait until like you've played your ass off and like everyone knows it wasn't you, right? But you lose and just be like, that was my fault. And then everyone will go, oh my God, I love him so much because it totally wasn't his fault. Like, let everyone else say that. And then you set yourself up for the time when maybe it was your fault. And then people are like a little bit more willing to give you that rope, because I'm with you. Like, you want to see that type of leadership.
That's what Brady did.
You want to see people say it, whether it was your fault or not. You just want the quarterbacks to take it. And then that's a solid leadership skill that helps the locker room, makes you feel like and people take a step forward.
And honestly, everybody's smart enough that people like us in media or whoever, even fans watching, like when Tom Brady would do that every single game, if they would lose and go out there and say, I got to be better, we would go on there and be like, no, Tom, it was 90+% completion percentage, 4 TDs, 300 yards again. Like, you actually were fine, but like, we appreciate the comment. But him saying, no, it's me, probably, the teammates probably appreciated it. Or the guy that really was to blame, maybe we didn't speak of because we're doing a whole segment on Tom Brady and how he's a great leader. So maybe he offered them kind of a cover for their issue. Whereas Aaron just kind of came off being like, you drop a pass, I hope you get ripped up in the media. Like, I don't want it. Like, that was but with the Jets, maybe that's not the case. And he has Cobb there to like basically be his mouthpiece on the field. And it's like, and I don't know. We will see. But I maybe
stay tuned. One of the things, just from a football standpoint, that I will have my eye on, because you never know in a 1 year sample size, what these numbers mean. But I was actually looking up catchable target rates for wide receivers to make an argument about D-Hop that I was having on my fantasy show, and using his catchable target rate being low and whatever. And one of the things that actually stood out to me was Garrett Wilson's catchable target rate obviously was very, very low last year. It was 75%. That's very low. And we all know how bad the quarterbacking was in New York. And so that's one of the things that when people say like Garrett Wilson's going to blow up this year, I think he will. I think he's a special talent. I think he's a very good wide receiver. And now just at the very least continuity at the quarterbacking position, that helps. But if his catchable ball rate was 75%, then I think the narrative is that's going to go through the roof this year, and that's no longer a problem. And think of all of the stats that he's going to put up. So then the next step for me was go look and see what the Green Bay wide receivers catchable target rate was. Christian Watson's was 76.9. So now he has an ADP a little bit further down the field. I want to say it's 14. So that's obviously a pass that is less likely to be completed on average. But Alan Lazard's catchable ball rate was 79%, I think. So it's still below average. These numbers are not great. And then I should point out Romeo Doubs was higher. It was in the 80% range. So obviously the closer we get to the line, then those balls were completed at a higher rate. But I'm a little bit like, well, that's Aaron Rodgers. That was Aaron Rodgers with other wide receivers. And catchable target rate has nothing to do with whether or not Christian Watson's good enough to catch it. It's somebody has looked at this and said that wasn't a catchable ball that came his way.
Yeah.
So maybe there were more of those in Green Bay than narratively we assume were there, because we're like, Aaron Rodgers is the best quarterback in the world, and or was, and he couldn't have fallen off that much. But I'm interested to see what he looks like, because we now, not the same as Jonathan Taylor, but now we have a different floor that we're talking about with Aaron Rodgers. Like, we've seen his play dip. Was it because the situation around him was so bad and he was just so like done with the coaching or the people or the environment or whatever, that he wasn't as locked in as you would expect? Or has he gotten to a point where, by the way, Mike Evans' catchable target rate was 74% from the GOAT? So like it happens as these quarterbacks get older. Is that where we are?
Right. And the argument that the team around me isn't enough, like that's not gonna work anymore for Aaron Rodgers. And you could also look at the numbers in terms of, yes, he won a championship, but it's many years ago now, and Aaron Rodgers' numbers all over the board, whether analytically or otherwise, from regular season to postseason, in a lot of these big postseason games, including games Green Bay was favored to win, just are not nearly as good. So if they would get into the postseason, and I think they're probably going to get in, and then Aaron has the same postseason game he's had for 3 or 4 years now in a row. It is not just 1 or 2. It is a theme now, 4 or 5 years in a row. Lose, then is Aaron giving you what you thought you were getting in Aaron? Like I do think there are some Jets fans out there that are thinking maybe they're getting Aaron from 7 years ago. Yes, when a quarterback gets older, you're going to be worse. And I know Brett Favre had the great year with the Minnesota Vikings when he turned it on. But, look, the Jet fans can go to that. Like, there was a lot of love around Favre. Oh, this is going to do it. And then, they were like a 500 team, and Favre had a bad year. So, like, there's no guarantees here. And that schedule is very, very tough. But, yeah, this isn't Aaron Rodgers from 6-7 years ago. I don't think this is MVP Aaron Rodgers anymore. But it will be interesting to me on how he handles it, and how that all goes. And if he really wants to play another year. Because, again, it's a wait and see thing with Aaron Rodgers as the wind blows. And, if this was 6 months ago, he was in a locked cave somewhere and
ready to retire, by the way.
But yeah, right. Didn't want to play at all. And he was ready to retire. And yeah, there's also a part of me that wishes he would have somehow had to go to Green Bay in training camp, and that should have just been Hard Knocks. Like, just throw that, forget that, that should have just been.
We're going to do joint practices.
Yeah, that would have been absolutely.
You know what would have happened though? He would have been the bigger person. I guarantee you, because that's my other read of Aaron Rodgers, is that he wants to win the narrative. Like, he wants to win it. He's aware of what people are saying, he is aware of the narrative, he wants to look like he's the winner in the Green Bay thing. And I think that there's enough self-awareness there to know that part of the way to do that is to act like he's the bigger person now. Like, if they did go there in joint practices, I bet you he would have gone over to Jordan Love and take the first step and done the whole like, hey, and like, good luck and all this stuff. Partially because there were cameras there, but partially because then this is a way of saying, like, to the fans there, like, see, it wasn't me.
Well, Lindsay, you know how smart that is and how much sense that makes? Think of it this way. You have Aaron Rodgers basically saying that dealing with the media is like a burden to him and he's above everybody. That was kind of what, like, the vibe he gave off. Yet he voluntarily did a weekly segment on Pat McAfee's show during this whole drama. He wasn't held against his will to be on the show, and knew that when he was there, everything he said was going to get on everybody else's show. He controlled the narrative almost 90% from that show, really, and didn't have to be there. So he put himself in a position to control the narrative while complaining about a narrative that other people are spinning when he's the one controlling it. And so, like, quite frankly, it actually was pretty smart.
Very galaxy brain here.
Yeah, it was a galaxy brain situation by Aaron Rodgers, but that's what he was doing. And I also kind of love the Aaron Rodgers story that I feel like we've come a little full circle to, because this is the same guy that publicly complained about how Favre wouldn't let it go and how, that whole drama. And now we're here with Aaron doing the same thing. So it's just nice when the world comes full circle and comes back around. But Lindsay, I appreciate you taking the time for sure. I could talk to you probably for hours on end. I'm glad that we actually got to do this, and it was a lot of fun. So I appreciate it. And
thank you.
Absolutely. And again, Sirius XM is where your show, the Rhodes show.
Well, so that is Fantasy Dirt 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern every weekday with Michael Fabiano. We're talking fantasy there. I think it's channel 87. I need to know that. Good grief, Lindsay. What number is it on Sirius XM, Lindsay? It's channel 87.
Okay.
I mean, when you have it as your preset, like you forget, but I should probably know what channel I'm on so that I can then promote it in these types of environments. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've had a blast talking to you. Really appreciate it. And I hope that you have a great football season tracking all of these stories and seeing if we're right.
Yeah. And I am a person that kind of, I like being right more than maybe even having things happen like that I would want to happen and go a certain way. I'll take a loss with my heart.
Me too.
To be correct.
That says a lot about us, Mike. Okay, like we're psychoanalyzing Aaron. Meanwhile, we are flawed human beings. Let's just make sure that's clear.
I just also thought of that quote out of nowhere. But yes, I will take a loss with my heart to be right with my mind. I don't know what that means. It probably doesn't reflect well on me. But yeah, sorry. Again, Lindsay Rhodes of Sirius XM. As she said, you probably have watched her in the past NFL Network. So, Lindsay, have a great night. I appreciate the time, and we'll be talking to you again, hopefully.
Thank you.
Lindsay Rhodes joining me. And again, that conversation, I could have talked to her another hour. That was longer than I thought that would go. I had to bump a few things, actually, that I had after that in terms of some radio hits because of this conversation. But, hey, I enjoyed it. We talked a lot of football, and we psychoanalyzed Aaron Rodgers, which I'm always about. So I want to remind everybody out there again, Mic Drop on the Believe Network. You can find this show wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, and then, of course, throughout the Believe Network, throughout their Believe channel and family of networks as well. You can find my coverage throughout the Sports Now family of networks, whether it be college or anything else going on in the region. Also find me on Twitter. It shows down there in the graphic. I will point to it. It is that way. I always point the wrong way, but at Mike Asti 11 there on Twitter. And you can find Lindsay on her show, NFL Rhodes Show. And of course, that is spelled NFL RHODES, like her last name, on Sirius XM Fantasy's channel. I believe she said channel 87 that I have to double check as well. And at Lindsay_Rhodes, and that is LINDSAY_RHODES. So again, thank you for the time from Lindsay Rhodes of Sirius XM and formerly of the NFL Network. And this has been another edition of Mic Drop here on Believe. It is football season. Football season is in the air. We're analyzing the field. We're analyzing fantasy. We're analyzing people's minds off the field and how we get here. So all of that tis the season, and we're going to keep on doing it for the next several months. Buckle your seatbelt, get ready, and this is the best time of the year for a reason.